All right, guys. So we've just kind of finished up with this Stalin's paranoia. We've talked a little bit. I want to point out this is considered maybe if you want to put the orthodox view, that Stalin really creates the tension. And I want to make sure you understand before we go to the next slides. I do think this is what your textbook misses. Your textbook misses the idea that Stalin created policies from 45 to 46 that challenged the agreements made at Yalta and cemented at Potsdam. This image clearly indicates the Declaration of Liberated Europe is not going to be successful at self-determination as you begin to see all of those states become part of the Soviet Union sphere. But we also see now throughout Southern and Western Europe, there's this sense of fear about the spread of communism. So let's look at this idea. So now we're going to look at the idea of Kennan's Long Telegram, 1946. George Kennan is a representative to the ambassador in Moscow in 1946. If we're doing an OPCVL on this long telegram is really important because George Kennan has detailed insight in the development of the Soviet Union as he is part of the ambassador's team. We know that George Kennan in 1946 was looking at the aftermath of World War II, and we know that he has inside knowledge on what Stalin is doing through their negotiations. The content of the long telegram will become the framework for what we know as containment. So if we're going to talk about, if we were a historian looking at the OPCVL on this, basically doing the outcome or the development of containment, what we'll talk about is, I've already talked about why George Kennan has inside knowledge, but really the content really gives us this idea about the reasons for the development of containment. Now, the limitation of the purpose is George Kennan doesn't even know what containment is going to be. That is not even there yet. This is the parameters. So as a historian, the concept of containment, this is in its infancy. So the purpose is not to convey or define containment. It's going to be basically give insight to the president. And we also know the content is really not about containment, but about reasons for. So those are the kind of things as I ramble. All right. So we see he's a key diplomat. And again, this is a private correspondence between Kennan and DC. This is basically classified information in 1946. This is not going to be given to the public. Now you might say, hey, Watts, did he have some in the public? Yep, we'll see that a little bit later. And again, the value of this document is huge. Now, the key points. He talks about how the USSR's actions were out of insecurity. He was talking about that all of the spreading of the Red Army is really about a fear that the West, the U.S. and Britain might in fact go to war with them, which I don't know if that's untrue. I think at this moment, Churchill is probably very happy, though he was friendly with FDR. They were good friends. When FDR died, I do believe he thought that Truman could be a good tool to assert that. I do want to point out he did point out the Soviets wanted to advance Stalinism. This is not really about communism. It's about Stalinism, a unique class of it. It's about totalitarian regimes, talking about limiting civil rights, and developing almost into a mercantile empire, if you will. He talked about the idea that the Soviet worldview justified cruelty and repressiveness. Where you and I, as Americans, might see this as a violation of civil rights, the Soviets saw it as a necessary evil to achieve stability. I think this is one of the most important quotes, and again, I'm just paraphrasing it, but he talks about the idea that the USSR was fanatical in the sense that they are following the leadership of Stalin. Stalin had successfully created a cult of personality, and that their army is going to follow his commands without question. But USSR was not suicidal. What he had concluded was the USSR was going to spread as far as possible, as far as the U.S. allows them to. But the moment in which the U.S. challenges them, they would not be the ones to enter war. Again, Kennan's Long Telegram, really important. Could be use your time to kind of skim through that, but we'll talk about that later. All right. So now Truman has read this. Truman is like, all right, so I see kind of the need. There is going to be a change in U.S. policy. The U.S. now, instead of being like World War I, where at the outcome of World War I, the United States retreated into isolation, Basically let Europe do what Europe's going to do. All of a sudden, Truman begins to realize there is a desperate need for the United States to assert themselves, especially as Great Britain is on the verge of economic collapse. They're now retreating from Greece. They're beginning a process of decolonization, as you remember. So now we come out by 1946, it appears to Truman that there's two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. And Churchill, who's now recently removed from prime minister, catches the ear of Truman. And to kind of usher in this, there's a graduation speech at, I think it's at Independence, Missouri. I forget what university it is. But what we see here is Churchill then unveils this Iron Curtain speech. And I think it's very important. You see Truman sitting behind him because Truman's presence here, he's invited Churchill to make this graduation speech, right? Or this speech, and he's over there. So there's a sense of almost a conspiracy, if you will. And Churchill does identify the Iron Curtain from the Elbe to the Trees rivers. He identified that the Soviet Union is Stalin as this evil tyrant taking over. The whole purpose of this, guys, I want to point out, this whole purpose of this speech is not really just to give information to the graduates of this university. This speech is really about creating a public reasoning for United States interaction. So again, the whole purpose of this is propaganda, pushing out the need for U.S. engagement in Europe even after World War II is over with. Now, immediately, the Soviets have a reaction to this Iron Curtain. Stalin's famous speech criticizes Churchill. He identifies Churchill as no different than Adolf Hitler. You saw parts of that speech in your reading. I do think it's huge. Stalin, to penalize the United States and the British for conspiring against him, he withdraws from the International Monetary Fund. The International Monetary Fund was this newly created policy group that came out of this thing called the Bretton Woods Conference that was supposed to help stabilize the global economy. He withdraws from it. He intensifies the anti-West propaganda. He begins to convey messages to his people that though they were once allies to us, now they are enemies. And then he initiates a 5-year plan. And that 5-year plan is about the remilitarization of the Soviet Union. And this is a very important aspect. I do think there's something that the book and I haven't really talked about. This is also in response of the ending of Lend-Lease. Lend-Lease was this policy where the United States lended money and resources throughout the war to help support it. Now, at the outcome of the war, they canceled it, even though these countries still needed access to the money. So now Stalin begins to realize he feels abandoned. He feels attacked by Churchill with Truman's kind of support. So therefore, he begins to break away and isolate, and he initiates this 5-year plan. And if you forget about this 5-year plan, when I think of the two things that come out of this, I think of the AK-47s, and I think about the Soviet jets that come out of this, and maybe most importantly, in 1949, they actually had their own atomic bomb. So this 5-year plan clearly is created to put pressure on the United States. So we kind of see that. So this is all reaction maybe to that Iron Curtain speech. Well, now, because the United States now sees this overreaction by the Soviet Union, now Truman is going to finalize his containment with the Truman Doctrine. This is going to be the State of the Union speech in 1947, and he's going to unveil what he talks about as containment. He officially calls it the Truman Doctrine. He talks about the moral obligation of the U.S. to support peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities, aka communists. He is referring to Turkey and Greece. I do think that's important you see that. And I want to point out that it's really important that you understand that Truman is conveying this as a public speech in hopes to convey American population that there's a need to change U.S. policy, because what's going to cost us? It's going to increase taxes. So he has to convey to the people the reason why the U.S. has to be contained and to justify the increase in expenditures. And here we're going to see two political cartoons. I love this first political cartoon. This first political cartoon really illustrates to the United States the need. What we have here, we have Truman and Stalin. I'm going to talk about Truman first. We see Liberty Hotel, and now he's ushering in these countries, right? So in these countries, and behind, I believe that's Turkey over here. That might be Greece, who knows? But all right, so these are people are happy. But here's Uncle Joe, Stalin, going into this here. I'm not sure what that ruse, pension ruse, and you see him forcing countries like Hungary. Which train car would you rather be on? I'm going to go with Liberty Hotel. And the whole point here, we see the Balkan district. This is going to be the idea. And this political cartoon clearly is in support of this new plan. The United States offers liberty, Stalin offers tyranny, and what does that look like? But it's not 100% supportive. This is a Republican cartoon that comes here, and what we see is the Truman Doctrine. We see a new foreign policy. We see it's a narrow law going over this dangerous water, if you will. We see the United States money to Greece and Turkey, and we're going blind into it. What's obviously going to happen? Uncle Sam, the United States, is going to fall in the water. And so those are two different point of views. You have a hope and you have fear. And I want to point out in 1947, the reason this is important, these political cartoons, is because it's not determined if this is the process that we're going to go. And once again, you already know that I, as a historian, look at it from an orthodox view. I blame Stalin for it all. Now, I'm not dumb. I do know the Truman Doctrine changes the predictability. The United States is now pledging to be involved in Western Europe even after war. That is going to be a shock to Stalin. But I do believe the U.S. is doing this in response to Stalin. In 1947, the Marshall Plan is put out, right? The Marshall Plan is not finalized. It's not secure. We're going to see why that's important. But the Marshall Plan, George Marshall, the Secretary of State, the great general of World War II, unveils this economic expansion of the Truman Doctrine. He believes that American money, capital, is necessary to revive the European economies. If these European economies do not get excessive United States capital, they are going to then turn into communists. I do think there's some validity to that. But even here, we see criticism. I love this Republican or conservative idea. What we see here is we see baby Huey, if you will, big giant baby here. He's trying to learn from his dad how to ride a bike. Does it seem very successful? I hope you see it. Probably not. Here we see the training wheels are the Marshall Plan. That's what the United States. And what this father is doing, the American taxpayer, he's going to keep pumping, right? Keep pumping to self-support. But the reality is, if you look at this political cartoon, is that going to be a success? So the message being conveyed by this cartoon is the Marshall Plan will never truly allow for Europe to become self-supporting. And in the end, the American taxpayer will be responsible for Europe from here on out. Which is kind of interesting. We know on this side of history, completely wrong. I want to point out the Soviet perspective. They're going to call this dollar imperialism. I do have a political cartoon later that will share that. But again, Soviet perspective, this is an American way to infuse capitalism, to infuse their need for resource, and they call this neo-imperialism. Now that's going to force Stalin to react. I do think there's some validity to this. And when we look at the Marshall Plan, we see the idea all countries are going to be offered it. I love this political cartoon. You may need to get closer. I love this. Again, this is a pro-American view. We see the Marshall Plan with a nice little new modern factory or a tractor. We see that he's very happy. I would want to be that farmer. The quote here is, it's the same thing without the mechanical problems. And what we see here is Stalin forcing the Eastern Europeans away from Western technology. and that the Marshall Plan is positive. The general Marshall Plan, right here, or the Marshall-Stalin Plan, I can't, is unhappy. That's not, let me try that again. And that's what we have. And I may have failed, that's okay. All right. And what we see here is a nice map about all the lands offered. And I want to point out the countries that are darker color are the ones that gain money, and the other ones are not. Now, a little fun fact: Spain's not offered because they didn't participate in World War II, and they are under a tyrannical view. But that's another story. Stalin refused to accept. Not only to accept, but he refuses his group here to accept, because what he feared was that the Marshall Plan would then force these countries into pro-American views. So instead, he forms the Comecon, and the Comecon is kind of the Soviet version of the Marshall Plan, where the Marshall Plan is pretty much over. I think it's by 1952 that it's over. The Comecon is going to be will be continuous throughout the Cold War and will not come to an end until 1989. So we can look at this, but again, the Marshall Plan is a significant shift in events, and I do think it's so important that you realize that the United States does get fully on board. They get fully engaged in Western Europe. That is going to spark the Soviet reaction. I do think the revisionists that identify the United States as the fault for the Cold War, I do think that there is some validity to them, but I'm going to backtrack and mitigate that and realize the only reason the United States is doing what they're doing is in response to the Red Army and the Stalinist tactics. Now, the Soviet response, the Coniform. This is going to be the Soviet Coniform, is the Soviet body that's going to oversee other communist countries. And Stalin basically reestablishes this. So all communist countries are going to be tied, at least in theory, to the Soviet Union. Stalin announced, using his foreign minister, Molotov, to unveil the two camps doctrine. And the two camps doctrine, very significant. What he identifies is there are two camps in developing. You have the Soviet camp and you have the American camp. And all of a sudden, when we start talking about camps, this is reminiscence, if you will, of World War I. We talked about, if you don't remember this from last year or your freshman year, there were two armed camps in 1914 that were ready to split. Likewise, when Stalin uses this language, people realize there's a threat of war. And I love this political cartoon. This is from Stalin's perspective. Look at the White House reaching for lands. And I'm not sure exactly all these countries. I'm pretty sure that's probably Turkey. But again, they're reaching, right? They're gremlins or evil hands. And then here's that wonderful political cartoon that really emphasizes the idea of dollar diplomacy. Yes, the United States is, quote unquote, supporting the Turks to do their dirty work, but they're doing it via the dollar. The dollar here is the machine gun. And the whole point of this kind of propaganda was to convey the fear and movement of the United States. Now, that's going to be where we are. I'm going to pause this one as well. So I want to finish this up before we get to this. I just want to point out, so what we've done now, we've kind of identified the development of containment. We've looked at Kennan's Long Telegram. We've looked at the Iron Curtain speech. We've looked at the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. You need to go back to your book and make sure you have some details that you're able to argue in your essay. And then I talked about the Soviet response along the line. Now, as we're looking at this response, it can be viewed that the Soviet Union is reacting to the United States. I want to point out again, the United States is in fact reacting to the Soviet Union. And we can have our debate over that if you'd like in class one of these days to see who's at fault, but very important that we comprehend that.